Hi, I'm Mo for YouTube videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. I was recently asked to look into the cancellation of the Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide podcast, and that sent me down a whole rabbit hole because I have completely and totally lost track of those people since their paths stopped intersecting with Alexa Nikolas this summer. We've already spoken a bit in my videos about some of the back and forth disputes between Alexa Nikolas of Eat Predators and the cast of the Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide podcast. I will link the relevant videos in the description below if you haven't already seen them or if it's been a while and you would like to see them again. I've only really seen the clips that were relevant to that, the episode that they had a guest star on who referred to Alexa as intense and implied that she was crazy. And I've also seen, various shorts that went viral either from PodCo or clips from the podcast that were being circulated on social media or, Facebook or Instagram Reels. I've gotten into this in my channel before, but I feel strangely about the Ned's Declassified podcast. I used them as an example, actually, in my first Eat Predators video as, something that I wouldn't have had so much of an issue with if it was something Alexa Nikolas was doing rather than her whole advocacy grift thing. I used them as an example opposite Eat Predators, though, to say that, while I'm not particularly interested in what they're doing over on their podcast, I hadn't found it, harmful or misleading enough about its intentions that I would have felt a need to make a video about it. Honestly, even now, and we will go into some of their controversies, I likely still wouldn't have made a video about it if it wasn't for the tie-in between the PodCo podcasts and subjects we have already discussed on this channel, and of course, for the recommendation that I look into this, so thank you very much. When I heard that the podcast had got canceled, I assumed that my follow-up video would be me discussing again the controversies that intersected their paths with Alexa, as well as a few other things that have happened before the podcast began and since it started. I assumed once I looked into it, especially considering Christy's earlier statement to Alexa in one of those beefs, that she wouldn't anticipate an apology from Lindsay if she were Alexa. I had assumed that, considering those controversies that we're going to get into, that Christy, Carlson, Romano had decided that it simply just was not worth it to continue to carry the Ned's Declassified podcast. I mean, to be clear, I guess no matter how much the rest of my speculation here shakes out and how much I'm right about, it does seem as though Christy, Carlson, Romano decided that it wasn't worth continuing to carry on the Ned's Declassified podcast on PodCo, but maybe not because of the controversies, or at least not just because of them. Have you checked on PodCo lately? PodCo is a podcast company, the podcast company, according to their branded microphones, owned by Christy Carlson Romano and her husband, Brendan Rooney. When I've talked about PodCo before in my videos, I primarily tend to give Christy Carlson Romano the majority of the credit for PodCo. That's because she's really the person who's, branding herself with it, and also because she's, the more famous person and the person who I was familiar with from my childhood. She was in Even Stevens. She played Ren, who I had a crush on. She also voice acted Kim Possible, who I had a crush on. According to a write-up in the New York Times from March of 2024, though, it was Brendan who actually pitched the Ned's Declassified podcast to Devin Werkheiser, who played Ned on the Nickelodeon show. For Werkheiser, the podcast came about when he needed it, he said. In 2021, he spent countless hours on a pitch for a Ned's Reboot, a survival guide for young adults, only for the studio to pass on it in a brief email. His career was floundering, and he, quote, spiraled into deep depression, end quote, he said. About a year later, Rooney approached him about starting a podcast. Werkheiser quickly embraced the medium, which he says gives him more freedom than he would have on a scripted show. He also relished the chance to reconnect with Shaw and Lee. It feels like we're back on set a little bit, he said. Some parts of our childish selves come out, so it does feel like we picked up where we left off. That's actually the very last bit of that write-up about him and PodCo. You can find it linked in the description below, and I'm going to be pulling from it again a little bit in the future here. But I would agree, yeah, the childish version of them comes out when they're filming their podcast. I think this is the exact joke that I made the first time that I talked about the Ned's Declassified podcast, but it is very strange to feel like you are given access to a table of people sitting around reliving their glory days, and the glory days in question were middle school. Devin has spoken a ton on social media and on the Ned's podcast once it existed about how badly he had wanted that Ned's Declassified reboot to happen.
There's a lot of versions of people asking, why don't we do the show for adults? But we don't own the IP for Ned, so we developed an idea. We pitched it to the studio who owns the IP, and as of now, they're just passing on it. That's it.
The Paramount didn't want to either pick it up or to sell him the rights so that he could go make it himself. So it just never went anywhere. What had looked to be a big break for him following the long stall of his post-Nickelodeon career was a role in the movie Rust, which you might not immediately be familiar with by name, but almost certainly will be if I say that movie where Alec Baldwin shot that lady with the gun that wasn't really a prop gun. Devin has spoken about this in terms of like how hard it was for his career, that movie he was really excited about had like such controversy and behind the scenes stuff, and not so much, from the clips I saw, not so much like, wow, a lady fucking died, but okay.
It was coming after a really like dark time in my life and dark time in my acting life. Like I felt so far removed from my career at that point. I was no longer one of the kids. I was one of the men on set, and I was playing this grungy ass like character role. I was literally living my dream on that set. We had this huge accident where our DP got shot and killed. That has been so fucking hard to deal with and process. Like everyone has an idea of what that set was, but if you weren't on it, you don't fucking know.
Lindsay Shaw, who played Mose, and Daniel Curtis Lee, who played Cookie, both did have a little bit more success in at least some of the intervening years between the end of their Nickelodeon career and the beginning of their podcast era. But those shows were Pretty Little Liars for Lindsay and Zeke and Luther for Daniel, respectively. So both of those have been off the air for quite some time, right? I want to jump back into that write-up from Rebecca Carballo. There was a time when I wanted to transcend Ned's, Werkheiser said, but maybe it's the answer in getting me where I want to go. Now 33, he's made peace with his past and is still giving tips to his peers, only he is using a more modern medium. In Ned's Declassified podcast survival guide, he and his former Ned's classmates, Lindsay Shaw and Daniel Curtis Lee, dish about the show, which aired from 2004 to 2007, and open up about past personal and career struggles. The three are among a cohort of former child stars, many from Nickelodeon and Disney Channel shows from the 2000s, who have started podcasts as a way of connecting with a nostalgic Gen Z and millennial fan base. In doing so, they are embracing roles that they played as children and teenagers, characters that some had spent years trying to move beyond, with mixed success. Part of the truth is, if any of our careers were maybe further along, maybe we wouldn't be doing podcasts, Werkheiser said in an interview. There are comments that speak to that, as if we don't know. Yeah, I don't find that hard to believe that they got comments speaking to that and maybe implying that they were, like a bit washed up maybe for doing this. I do want to say, believe it or not, I do have a little bit of nuance here. I've just spent a little bit too much time hearing former child actors talk about getting maybe screwed over with their Coogan accounts, maybe not getting residuals in the first place because they were on children's TV, to not have a bit of empathy for somebody who didn't really get a chance to keep much of the money that was earned off of their work as a child, coming back around to kind of get a chance to profit from it now. I do still think that's mostly fine. I feel empathy for it, as I said, but not interest in it. It's not an empathy that would draw me into actually spending time with a rewatch podcast, and I can't think of like a cast that might start a rewatch podcast that would get me really into this concept. But the Ned's Declassified cast doing this is kind of one of the straightest shots that they do for like casts talking about a show. There were other characters in Ned's, sure, but if you had to pick any three to get like a core trio feeling, you would have picked Lindsay and Daniel and Devin. So this podcast made a lot of sense. More sense than like the Lindsay Shaw podcast about Pretty Little Liars, where it is her and a co-host who was also not actually a main character on the show. We will get to that. That is its own section, I promise. The Ned's Declassified podcast did extremely, extremely well at first. I think it had not just the benefit of having such a large portion of its core cast in the podcast cast, but also that it was sort of out towards the front of this nostalgia bait trend They didn't get in quite as early as Christy did with Vulnerable, which she started in February of 2022, compared to Ned's March of 2023 launch. And then the Pretty Little Liars one that we're going to talk about later, that one launched in April of 2024, this year, the same year that both Pretty Little Liars True Crime and the Ned's Declassified podcast would be announced to be dropped. The Ned's podcast was, at one point, Apple's top-rated podcast in movies and TV shows, and we will go through those controversies that might have led a greater woman than Christy, Carlson, Romano to cancel the show, I promise, but I do feel like it would just be a little dishonest to lead with those and not with what was probably the biggest factor in this cancellation, just the numbers. So the first episode of Ned's Declassified podcast Survival Guide from last March is sitting at 1.9 million views. For comparison, when I sorted Christy Carlson Romano's videos by popular, because that's where she hosts her podcasts, including the Vulnerable podcast, the most popular episode of that was with Annalise Vanderpool, who played Chelsea on That's So Raven, and that one is sitting at 538,000 views, compared to 1.9 million for the first of the Ned's one. To be clear, 583,000 views is a lot of views. It is a lot of views. That is about 50,000 more views than my channel shows when I sort by, like, my entire lifetime of my channel. It's a lot of views. It's a lot of people watching your stuff. It's just, well, it's not really close to 1.9 million views, right? And I also, I mean, we'll get to this eventually, I can't help but to wonder if that episode she co-hosted with Annalise Doing Well is why that's one of her other podcasts. It ended up happening where she has a podcast that she co-hosts with Annalise Vanderpool, and I had thought that kind of seemed like a sort of random pair-up to me, but maybe now I'm realizing that it's because audience had already really responded well to the two of them together. So the Ned's podcast started not just strong, but stronger than Christy's shows did. But those views were not steady. First of all, I imagine a lot of people clicked on it and then clicked off without finishing because they didn't really like it. And second of all, I imagine a lot of other people clicked on it because they were like, I wonder how these child actors I haven't checked in with since middle school are doing. And then they checked in and then they left. The second episode is not near as popular as the first episode, but it still was holding stronger than a lot of similarly timed episodes of Vulnerable, Christy Carlson Romano's show. The second one gets 514,000 views, down from 1.9 million, but still not bad. It's not a number to sneeze at. It's just that this pattern of constantly downgrading by so much is not sustainable, because by the next episode, they're down again to 329,000 views. Fourth episode, 277,000. By the fifth, as I'm looking at this, I'm starting to think maybe they leveled out and found something closer to their regular number. Rather than nearly halving again, they're at 241K, which is like close enough to 277K. But at episode 6, they're not quite to 200,000 at all, and they don't get back there again until episode 16. By episode 16, they've settled into having, like, guest stars on with them. It is the presence of the actor who played Coconut Head that got them up to 301,000. They won't hit this again without either a guest star or clickbait. Episode 17, Ned and Moses' real-life breakup addressed. That counts to me as clickbait. That one was successful, but not as successful as the Coconut Head episode. Clickbait one is at 234,000 right now. There are some outliers here in either direction, like all the way down at 64,000 for a Halloween episode last year, and all the way up to 656,000 for another video that clickbaits about Lindsay and Devin's relationship as teenagers, besides the breakup one. But by around December of 2023, the Ned's Declassified podcast views really seem to have leveled down. All the way from that 1.9 million viewership launch to about 100,000, and then even further down from that. Their 1-year anniversary video from March is sitting at 33,000 views. Even when they tried to do another clickbait, this one about Lindsay and Devin having a baby, that one managed to limp to 50,000. 6 months ago, Matt Bennett from Victorious got them up over 60,000, but they went back to under 50,000 right after that again, once he was gone. And then there's a run of between like 33 and 13,000 views. Looking at it like right now, their most recent video before their announcement video is sitting at like 16,000 views. I'm a small enough channel that I'm stoked when I get this 16,000 view mark. That's a lot for me, but I highly doubt anything that's owned and operated by a larger production company shares my enthusiasm over those sorts of numbers. I'm not paying for studio space or editors, post-production, equipment even. I film on my cell phone and I have a nice microphone out of the kindness of Paige Christy's heart because she saw me swinging around a little lav mic when I first got started. Any money that I make from my ad revenue, I get to just keep and spend on stuff that I need. That's not the case with a PodCo podcast. They have much more overhead than I do, as is obvious just from the quality of the podcasts and the studios that they're set up in. And there's way more employees, and in the Ned's Declassified case, even if there weren't any outside employees to look at, even splitting it 3 ways compared to me getting to just keep my YouTube money probably would also put a dent in splitting that kind of revenue. So to me, looking at just the numbers and at the fact that that write-up from earlier this year said that PodCo wasn't yet turning a profit and was hoping to by next year, I actually do think that Ned's is just one of a rash of cancellations for similar reasons, and not because of much fun drama behind the scenes. Which of course isn't to say that there was no drama at all. There was drama, we knew about it, but it was in front of the scenes. We've covered some of it already, and I'm going to circle back to more of it in this video. I just want to make it clear that even though that all happened and it feels relevant to the conversation that we are having here, I don't think it actually was relevant to the decision to cancel the podcast. And that's for a couple reasons. The biggest of which being just like, I don't think there are controversies or allegations or anything that exist that are big enough that Christy, Carlson, Romano doesn't want to yuck it up with you and put you on her podcast network for money if that's going to be profitable for her. That's why the Corey Feldman episode of Vulnerable stayed up for so long and only eventually came down in tandem with the Alexa episode. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong, but I just personally don't think that the controversies that the Ned's podcast crew had or found themselves in were like any water at all off of Christy Carlson Romano's back. I just genuinely do not think she cares about that kind of thing. I just don't want to accidentally give her credit that isn't due here in terms of the Ned's Declassified podcast cancellation. That's why I'm being clear here that like I am speculating about pretty much all of this, other than the fact that pretty much nobody seems to still be watching PodCo podcasts compared to when they were in their heyday. I've got, I don't know, just some thoughts about the Ned's Declassified podcast, because really, a large chunk of the things that I've seen people talk about and that they have been in controversy for has sort of been, I would say, in the realm of oversharing. Either that, you know, it makes people uncomfortable hearing them talk about their sex life as teenagers, or people are just, like, tired of that same subject being rehashed and rehashed. I already mentioned when I was saying which videos were getting, like, a lot of attention, you can kind of see them try to trace that thread of, like, oh, maybe they like when Lindsay and Devin talk about having been in a relationship as teenagers. And also, you know, maybe that's kind of all a podcast like this really has to offer. I'd be really interested to know, like, how much of them leaning into that is just because that's how it went, and how much of it is, like, you know, when you see that I knew it was bad just, like, from the numbers, but especially when I made the graph. Like, when you see that drop off from episode 1 to the next one, and then all of them after that, I wonder, you know, at some point they're trying to give what people are responding to, and it just seems like they don't really have a good grasp on what they can give that people will respond to. Like, there's the thumbnail that they have with them as teenagers, and, like, eggplant and peach emoji to make it very, very clear they're talking about sex. I think that's weird. I do think it's weird. I had said in a previous video that I was under the impression that the sex was happening, like, on the set, and apparently that's not the case, which I am still relieved to know. But I don't want to hear about that. I think a lot of people don't want to hear about that. I guess also a lot of people do, and that's why those are the ones that got some views, but, like, no thank you. And we've already discussed this as well in, like, my original videos from Alexa. But when the Quiet on Set documentary came out this summer, they were live streaming, and they were making weird and lighthearted and inappropriate jokes including Devin saying, let me find the clip.
Daniel, we told you never to speak about that. Get back in your hole, Daniel, and give me your holes. Sorry, we shouldn't joke about this. We really shouldn't.
This is awful. Why are we doing this?
Because this is about us. Listen, our set was not like that. And no, it's awful. The Drake Bell is that's crazy to hear. Not talking about this anymore.
No.
Guys, we can't joke like this. Jesus. Guys, we're sometimes humor helps us move through things.
So this was happening during a live stream. Obviously, this wasn't like scripted or like it was just an off the cuff thing. But it's weird and it's bad and it's gross, especially with the context of quiet on set, which they would claim later in their apology that they had no idea what was in quiet on set. But I feel like give us your holes is a very specific joke. And especially to say that and then to be like, oh, our set wasn't like that. I don't believe them that they just didn't know what quiet on set was about. I think that was just the only possible way to attempt to dig them up. But I think if Christy, Carlson, Romano was going to cancel them over that, she would have done that several months ago and not just only recently. Okay, so I have known this and I've seen other people reference it as if it's a known thing, but I cannot find the actual origin for it other than a tweet that she had apparently retweeted that was saying, does Lindsay Shaw actually support Trump? And if she does support Trump, at least she obviously supports gay rights. And somebody said on Reddit that Lindsay had retweeted that, but I couldn't find any explicitly pro-Trump things from Lindsay Shaw. But I did hear multiple people say that they were under the impression from the 2016 election cycle that Lindsay Shaw is a Trump voter. And, I don't even disbelieve it. No, I don't really think that woman voted for Hillary Clinton, come to think of it, and I don't really think she voted for Kamala Harris either. I don't know. I haven't directly heard about anybody else other than in my comment section on my community post, somebody pointed out, Devin kind of gives frat boy vibes. He seems the type. And I said in my response, I don't know enough about Daniel to really make a statement because he seems very quiet on this podcast. And I know I already said I'm doing a lot of speculation on this video and that I will tell you which parts of it are speculation. This part is speculation, but I've kind of gotten a vibe that I'm not sure how much Cookie still likes these people. And I think the reason that I think that is because of this, which is what I was referring to earlier when I said that there was a controversy that happened ahead of the podcast even existing. There was a two-step dance trend going around on TikTok, and for some reason Lindsay Shaw had a real problem with it. I'm finding the clips that I can.
Hey, are we okay? What the f*** is this?
But, okay, so there was a TikTok trend of a two-step dance that creators were doing, and Lindsay Shaw duetted it just to be I don't even know, just catty white lady, what the fuck is this? Are we okay? What are you guys doing? And she got a lot of backlash for that because when she was making a point to attack a dance like that was clearly from creators of color, it's okay, is this just racism? Which I think probably it was, because I don't think that she's responded that strongly to other TikTok trends that she hasn't noticed were stolen from black dancers, when most of them are, Fortnite dances too. Anyway, though, she had gotten pushback for that, and again, I will try to find a clip of how she responded to it on her Instagram, because it was bad.
Okay, I just have to say right now that the hate in my inbox is not okay. Okay? I did not mean anything in any kind of way. I am learning every day, as I think everybody is. And this kind of hate just needs to evaporate from the planet, no matter who it's directed towards. Crocodile tears, No, dude, like, this is like my soul out there. If you know anything about what I stand for or what I believe in, you know that it's not this. I am sorry you were offended. I think we all need to vibrate higher for the future. And I know I'm gonna keep learning. I think, like, for my own mental health, I needed to take a step back from social media. I kind of felt like that anyway, but it's like, I'm not here to offend or belittle anybody at all. I thought that the millennial and Gen Z thing was a thing on TikTok. The intention wasn't that serious, y'all.
It was like the worst possible way that she could have responded to it. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person who thinks that. Well, I know I'm not the only person who thinks that, but Daniel Curtis Lee has also said something to the effect. I found this on TMZ from the time.
And she was crying on the video. I told her, because she reached out to me once people were, hitting her with the racist vibes, you got to call your one black friend, let society tell it. But, I mean, I was like, no, I told her that she should, if she's going to respond to the negative comments claiming that she's racist, she's got to do something lighthearted, but she didn't take my advice. And she went the crying route, and people feel like that's weaponizing tears and things like that. So it was just like a PR nightmare there. So it was rough.
This was obviously before the whole PodCo rewatch thing. This was a couple of years ago, and I do remember seeing this and being like, "Oh, that's Cookie from Ned's Declassified, huh?" And then when the podcast happened, I kind of wondered whether or not he was going to be a part of it, and he was. But I kind of wonder if he's still going to be. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he is, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he dips, which is a very nothing statement now that I'm saying it out loud. But by that, I mean, he might as well be part of it, but also I think if he's tired of these people and he's annoyed by them, he might not want to continue to do a podcast if it's not as guaranteed a paycheck as it was while they were, like, under contract with PodCo. And they do not seem to be under contract with PodCo anymore. Like I said, we had that announcement video that I didn't get into yet. Daniel also did defend Lindsay, so I want to play that part of the video too, even though, like I said, I think it was probably racially motivated. She did get defense from Daniel that wasn't the case at the time.
I felt like Lindsay just gave a non-tasteful take, but Lindsay is already a pretty edgy person. She's going to speak her mind immediately. Like I say, she said 9 words in the video, and none of them were racist. So if you want to go to just the evidence or the brass tacks of what was said, she didn't say anything racist. I know a lot of people feel as though her responses to some comments were a little bit saucy, something like that. But I didn't see anything racist, bro. I can't say that. What can Lindsay do right now to make things right? Man, she kind of has to just let it blow over or take some courses. I work really closely with Chantel Steve. She's a research activist, and I sent Lindsay a text saying that, maybe you could look into implicit bias courses to really see if there is some validity, because people were offended when she first sent me that video. I was like, yo, people are offended. You're gonna have to deal with it. Try to deal with it in a lighthearted way. She chose the cry route. I did not advise that. And, people smelled blood in the water, and it's time to eat. They were ready to feast because there's already momentum behind protecting Black creators, especially in the TikTok sphere. Gen Zs, they're gonna, protect, equality and look out for these people who have been historically overlooked in American history.
Devin also defended her, and I'm not going to play the clips of that because I don't really care. But Lindsay responded again in a video that I just found after I had recorded the first portion of this last night.
So I want to talk about the situation that happened a year and a half ago on TikTok with a TikTok that I made of a dance move. I stitched together a video criticizing the dance move and hating on the dance move. This video was made by 3 Black men, and the content of the video got skewed towards skin color. And This is what I've learned in a year and a half, and it took me a super long time. Being a hater is not cool at all, no matter what. No matter what you're hating for, no matter, like, I was being a hater, you know? I was being a hater because in my mind, I knew what should have had. It had 17 million likes at the time that I saw it, right? Like millions upon millions of views. And in my mind, I judged the creation as something that shouldn't have had 17 million likes, right? Because it wasn't as clever, as intricate as what I thought was clever and should have that many likes, right? Like, I, you know, follow a lot of creators who, in my opinion, make masterpieces that are never recognized like that, right? And myself, like, I want to be recognized as somebody. I put effort into these, and it was stuck in a mindset of thinking, somebody has something that I want, and they're not deserving of it, right? I feel as though I can't even speak on a situation that I co-created and was a part of. And I don't want to be scared of that or of anything. It's something that I have sat with and tried to do so much introspection on how to never let being a hater or jealousy ever affect my work again. And as to any other morally reprehensible behaviors you might have heard about me via hearsay, if we're going to hold people accountable for their blackout, addicted, mentally ill states, then hold me accountable. But I am doing living amends to hold myself accountable to that time, right? I care about my output and its impact. I just want to focus on being a more positive addition to every situation and not a hater. Okay, right on. Love you.
It's still not much better of an apology at that point, though, right? I mean, you know, maybe if this is how she had responded the first time rather than the crying videos, it would have been different for her. But I have seen this particular thing, and also another thing where she was complaining in a TikTok that... Goodbye. Another thing where she was complaining in a TikTok that I can't find the original version of. She was like, oh, Spider-Man can get rebooted a bunch of times, but Ned's Declassified can't even get a made-for-TV movie. And that has, like, really bothered people because it's just, like, it's a very stop trying to make fetch happen sort of feeling that I'm picking up on that a lot of people have towards these three. And I do want to go over that announcement video together. It's not very long, but we're gonna watch it together.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, Devin. I'm not gonna interrupt this often. I just thought that would be like a little bit funny. Less convinced now that I've actually done it out loud.
We have some exciting news, but first we also have some in-between news? Medium news. So let's deal with that first before we get to the exciting stuff.
Okay, I said that and then I am cutting in even though this is less than 2 minutes long. They're lying about having exciting news. Like it's well, we'll get there. But like they say, like first we have interesting news and then we have exciting news, but this whole thing is just not being very upfront with their fans.
Ned's Pod is going through a change right now, and we kind of have been. So
we're under new management.
Yeah, it's us now, which will lead to varying results.
Oh yeah, results may vary. You know.
Yeah. So basically, Ned's Pod and PodCo, we are breaking up amicably, right?
Yeah, we love it.
We're all going in different directions. They're dropping some shows, so we are now production company-less.
They're dropping some shows. So it's not just Ned's. It wasn't just the Ned's Declassified podcast getting canceled, which I've already mentioned, but this is how I learned that. I was going to take you through like my research process, and then that wasn't as interesting as I thought it would be. But I heard him say they're going in a different direction. Some shows are getting dropped, and I was like, wait, what other shows? Which I have dug into, and we will get to. But let's continue their announcement first.
But
we independent.
Yeah, which is cool. But it also means we have a lot to figure out in the next coming months. We definitely want to continue the pod in some form. We got to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah.
And so stay tuned for details for that.
Bear with us.
We would also just like to take this moment to say thank you to each and every person who tuned in for one episode, for all the episodes, for 20 minutes, for a short clip.
Yes.
We so appreciate it. I know there has been so much healing on my heart because of this pod and getting back in touch with you two.
For real.
I feel so blessed for the conversations and the guests that we've had, the feedback.
Yeah, I'm proud of what we've done. I'm proud of our pod and what we've put out there. And then yes, just getting back in life with you guys has been a beautiful thing.
The biggest one.
So we're grateful, you know, like we launched something that was really cool and special, and whatever is next for us, we're looking forward to it. We just don't know what it is.
So if you have any suggestions, go ahead and put them down
Yeah,
below.
put them in the comments. So yes, so we love you.
So, yeah, all of that tracks, whatever. They're grateful. I'm sure they are. I'm sure for a while they were making a lot of money. 1.9 million views is a lot. This next part, too, this is what I mean when I'm saying they're just, like, being mean and faking out.
All right, are we ready for the exciting stuff?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, guys. When we started this pod 2 years ago, we always hoped that it could lead to a reboot.
As far as I'm aware, as far as I've been able to find anything, there's no actual plans of a reboot. They haven't clarified at all what this means. I really think it's just an attempt to get people to follow them to whatever they're doing next, or maybe they will do their own reboot and they just won't name it Ned's or something. I don't know. But, you know, that's what really tipped me off here from just, oh, they probably got canceled because they're not very professional, to, wait, something's going on with PodCo. Him saying PodCo is going in different directions. PodCo is dropping some shows. So that's when I started doing a little more research. I tried to remember which other podcasts were PodCo originals. I knew that there was a Wizards of Waverly pod. And when I looked it up, that one also had made a recent cancellation announcement. So I looked around at some of the podcasts that I was aware of. I started taking my little notes about what seemed to be going on each of those channels, because despite being production company-less, the Ned's Declassified podcast channel is posting clips of their old episodes, and it still very much has all of the PodCo branding, like the little box in the side and everything. So I don't know if that means that PodCo still owns the old episodes, and so they're doing sort of a syndication thing. I don't know if that was just already there, so they're uploading clips to try to get some ad revenue, and the PodCo branding is just still in there. I'm not really sure. When I looked up PodCo on Apple Podcasts, I could find only 4. Christy, Carlson, Romano's Vulnerable podcast, which is a given because that's Christy herself. The Ned's Declassified podcast, which we now know was canceled. A Full House Rewind podcast, which we're going to talk about in its own section. And Big Names, which is that podcast that I had mentioned with Annalise Vanderpool and Christy, Carlson, Romano. And that tells me that things have already been unlisted from the Apple Podcasts PodCo categorization, because there are definitely at least some other podcasts that should be on there. I know there was one called, like, I Hear Voices or something, and it was with the actor who played the voice of Ron Stoppable. I know that there was a Pretty Little Liars podcast. Like I said, that's still going to be its own section. I'm aware of a handful of other ones, too, but I can only find these 4 listed. And that's when I thought, okay, I'll just go to the PodCo website. And, again, I will ask, have you checked on PodCo lately? I'm using still images because I found the flicker effect to be really nauseating with my photosensitivity, so I didn't want to put anyone else through that. If I hadn't already known from doing research for a Christy versus Alexa video a couple of months ago that this was an existing asset for the PodCo website, I would have thought that this was like a new thing and that I had discovered some kind of alternate reality game. This flickering TV asset, which I'm showing you still photos of, because again, I don't want to punch anyone in the eyeballs, right? Not a concern that Christy, Carlson, Romano shares with me, I suppose. And there's like some ambient noise in the background too to get across like TV static. This was kind of the gateway in. You enter the site, and then there was that, and then there was all of the different shows. And now, the only listing I can find of PodCo shows is that one through Apple Podcasts. And I'm wondering, is PodCo responsible for that? Is PodCo listing those episodes? Are those just still tagged with PodCo somewhere, and they managed to take the PodCo tag off of the other ones? what's going on with PodCo? And it's not even something that I have a clear and distinct answer for. Again, this is probably the third time I'm saying this. I'm doing a lot of speculation in this video because there's not an existing write-up yet, I don't think. What do exist, though, are a lot of write-ups about Christy, Carlson, Romano, and PodCo, and about what an amazing and cool thing PodCo is. And not just in the context, we read from that article earlier, and I'm going to read from it again here in just a moment. That one was saying, oh, this is a cool thing that it is doing for specifically Devin Werkheiser and Lindsay Shaw and Daniel Curtis Lee. But Christy, Carlson, Romano was presenting this as, a public service that she was doing and bestowing onto other former child actors. That's an added layer to all of this, and it's a layer of it that I find more interesting to kind of criticize and pick apart than I do the angle of, saying a million times, oh, this isn't a sort of podcast I would watch. But I do want to talk about how Christy, Carlson, Romano is sort of pitching herself and her podcast company in these interviews versus the shows that were actually being produced and versus how the people who were on those shows may have been being treated. Because we do have a little bit of information that we can use to piece together some of that, and doesn't look great for Mrs. Carlson Romano. And Kayla Says also has a video about the Ned's Declassified podcast and why the show is not ever going to get a reboot. You can watch that one. I'm going to link it in the description below if you were hoping for a little bit more focus on the Ned's podcast as I'm kind of wrapping them up. We will speak about Lindsay Shaw again, though, because she comes up with the Pretty Little Liars podcast. Lindsay Shaw will come back up. Lindsay Shaw will return in the Pretty Little Liars podcast segment. But first, what did Christy Carlson Romano think she was doing? Because I think if you asked pretty much anybody with any kind of grasp on what PodCo is, what was PodCo doing, they would say, oh, it was nostalgia bait rewatch podcasts. And that's a pretty easy pitch too, but it's not exactly the pitch that Christy Carlson Romano was attempting to make. Romano says it was never her plan to capitalize on nostalgia. Rather, she said, she ended up greenlighting shows featuring former stars of Disney and Nickelodeon teen sitcoms because they were people she knew and could trust. She hopes the podcasts are places these stars can feel heard, she said. We've been a silent, niche population of people that were conditioned to be compliant and never truly understood our autonomy, Romano said. I want to show them that they can be empowered by having these podcasts. It's a really nice thought, isn't it? And it sort of turns these rewatch podcasts into a form of support that we're showing for these child actors. I mean, it already is. This isn't quite as explicit of a support token as the Eat Nickelodeon t-shirts Alexa Nicholas was selling off the success of Quiet on Set, for example, but it is still sort of an I felt bad about child actors and all I got was this lousy podcast, if you will. I don't disagree with what Christy is saying about child actors being conditioned to be compliant and agreeable. I don't even disagree that it could be a really great way for people with existing waiting fan bases to do something that's a little more involved than just influencership brand deals are on Instagram stories. Let them make content. That's kind of a great idea. But I do have a point that you might already have in mind about why we know that this is not how that played out in practice with Christy's business model. I promise we're going to get there. But I want to talk about the pre-PodCo era of Christy Carlson Romano's YouTube channel a little bit before we do. Because in theory, Christy Carlson Romano would know pretty well how much making her own money from her content could help her. She has been making content on her YouTube channel regularly for years. Her description specifies feel-good content every week, and a lot of those videos are re-uploads, especially recently, but my god, does this woman upload consistently. There are 574 videos on her channel, and I'm not going through all of them for this video. I'm going to start by sorting by the oldest, and then we're going to look at the most popular ones, especially since that's what I had already pulled up earlier, and I think there are some interesting trends there. So let's call everything we just talked about with the Ned's cast and their show's cancellation part 1, and this is part 2, the Christy Carlson rabbit hole. The oldest upload on Christy's channel is Christy's Kitchen Throwbacks, or her introduction to it, but then the first few episodes as well. That was a series she did that very much, despite what she says PodCo was not trying to do, was capitalizing on nostalgia. We can give her the credit that maybe that didn't stay the mission statement once PodCo existed, but to me it seems to be the mission statement of, like, Christy, Carlson, Romano as a brand. The first few episodes of Christy's Kitchen Throwbacks feature various child actors and Disney stars. Will Friedle, who voiced Ron Stoppable, she made the Naco with him for their first episode, and it is the most popular video on her channel, with 2.6 million views after 5 years. The first time she uploaded it, at least. I also found it interesting to see who is and isn't referenced by name or character name in these videos, not because I'm actually reading into it. I don't think there's, like, a coherent statement to be made there. I just think it's awkward in a way that tells me that she either couldn't quite find her footing, or that clickbait just makes things awkward. Lizzie McGuire, little brother, tells all. Kim Possible and Matilda make the tart. Kim Possible and Victoria's sister make vegan sushi. Kim Possible and Even Stevens' Larry Beale cook Rasta pasta. Kim Possible and youngest Lawrence brother bake pizza. There are more, I'm not going to list them all, but a couple of the guest stars on the Kitchen series have already caught my attention at this point. Will Friedle, I've already mentioned, he ended up on the network that way. And so did youngest Lawrence brother. We will get to that later when we talk about other podcasts. A lot of these guests in her first series came back later for her podcasts, for other podcasts like the Ned's Declassified podcast, or they got their own podcasts later, again like the Ned's Declassified podcast. Devin Werkheiser had an episode with Christy in 2019, long before the Ned's podcast would be pitched to him. There are some vlogs also sprinkled in amongst the early cooking content, but largely it's all nostalgia bait and guest stars. Other than that, that was what was most successful and what seems to have remained her bread and butter, at least up to the beginning of PodCo's formation. There are also date night vlogs with her husband, get ready with me, camera ready makeup routine, a couple of Fashion Nova fashion shows where I guess Christy, Carlson, Romano was just buying a bunch of fast fashion and putting it on. That was all happening concurrently with the Kitchen Throwbacks still uploading. And then she posted a channel update to announce that one of her videos would be late and also that she was launching a new series, which is when she kind of shifted for a bit into React content. Same deal as Kitchen Throwbacks, a lot of these guests in the React content later ended up starring in other PodCo productions. I'm sure that's like a matter of just having industry contacts, right? If they said yes once, maybe they're going to say yes again. Maybe they're all on the same network and they like agree to go on each other's shows. I don't know. A lot of the Reacts hosts also did like, they clearly filmed at the same time, right? So they would do like a Cinderella story tacos with Drew Seeley, and then also Drew Seeley reacts to another Cinderella story. And also these are all like 10, 12, 8-minute long videos. I wonder if that's another reason where the podcasts aren't doing as well as the shorter ones did, because people's attention spans just aren't that long for this kind of thing. I don't know. Moving over to sort by most popular. Again, most popular is that first Ron Stoppable Naco video, but then her other most popular videos. You have Why I Don't Talk to Shia LaBeouf Anymore. And that one is interesting. She doesn't exactly say like, oh, I never liked him, but she's also like, oh, we were never really close, but it's very flattering to me that people thought that we were close and that it was like I was his older sister. And also this was like, I believe timed with when he was in the news cycle a lot because he had been cast in and then not actually in the final version of the Don't Worry Darling movie. These were vlog series. She would like walk and talk and you know, she talked about a lot of things. She talked about not having like a Disney fortune, which I guess is why she was buying fast fashion to do fashion shows with. But even those where she's like walking and talking, when you're sorting by popular, it's not like the majority of what's showing up. So leaning into the podcast stuff makes sense. Again, second row here, you're getting out of the reaction content directly. You're getting out of her cooking. That's So Raven Star speaks out on substance abuse and child acting. That's an episode of the Vulnerable podcast. I expected like a pretty even mix of reaction content and vulnerable content to be on her most popular, but it's really mostly reaction content and then probably the kitchen content and a few of her videos where like, you know, How I Lost Princess Diaries to Anne Hathaway. And she's saying, oh, Anne Hathaway and I were in the same waiting room to audition, and I might have gotten that role and I didn't. How Katy Perry got my record deal because she was going to record a song that Katy Perry had done a demo for, and then Katy Perry ended up recording it, I guess. I talked about this when I talked about her in conjunction with Alexa Nicholas. I think part of what hinders Christy's content from being, like, toothy is that she's very much kind of always, it feels, trying to play her cards just in case she might get an offer for a reboot from Disney. And up to this point, she hasn't. Like I mentioned earlier, the Vulnerable podcast began in 2022, and her first guest on that was, again, Will Friedle, actually. She has had, like, a ton of guests on Vulnerable. According to IMDb, there's, like, 102 episodes of Vulnerable, though. Again, I'm not going to watch all of those. I can't do that to myself. She has not just former child actors, though. She also has scientists and activists. It's also a lot of former child actors. It's like mostly, probably majority, former child actors. One of her repeated guest stars on the Vulnerable podcast, and someone who I didn't see participating in the kitchen throwback or the reaction videos that Christy, Carlson, Romano was having, is Allison Stoner. Allison Stoner also has come up a lot on this channel. Like I said, the request for me to talk about this made a ton of sense because I've already talked about so many of these people. Allison Stoner has been on multiple episodes of Vulnerable, and those I have watched. Allison's first episode of Vulnerable is the 4th of the series and the earliest one I've seen. I thought it was at least notable to me. The PodCo branded microphones are not there yet. I'm not sure whether or not PodCo already existed. I don't think it did, though. The production value in this is pretty visibly lower, which I'm obviously not saying is a dig. Again, I film on my phone. But I am pretty sure that this was the beginning of Christy, like, renting studio space for her podcasts. Maybe I'm being naive that I thought that the kitchen throwbacks were really in her kitchen. Sound off in the chat. Was she paying for studio space all the way back during those kitchen throwback ones, or do you think that started with this PodCo expansion? I don't want to recap these whole episodes of Vulnerable. You can go listen to them yourself if you want to, and also if you want to just listen to Allison Stoner and not have to deal with Christy, Carlson, Romano, I cannot recommend their Dear Hollywood series highly enough. It is hosted on their own YouTube channel. So while we're not going through the full thing, I want to show you part of what they talked about in this first episode of Vulnerable. I just really respect and admire Allison, and I also think that they are where Christy borrows a lot of the language she uses that is effective about child stars from.
I had written an op-ed at some point last year, maybe it was a few years ago at this point, time is irrelevant, and it was talking about the psychological impact of child actors in the industry, and I wasn't interested in conveying another kind of drama-filled narrative. Right. It wasn't about the true Hollywood story. It was, how does this translate to better caring for young people in the industry, but also broadly speaking, like, can we ask some important questions here? If this child is categorically performing the same things that would be considered child labor, right, sometimes forced labor.
100%.
Then where is the line of what should and shouldn't go on, and who's looking out for them, and why are there no resources for parents?
Why is this an issue?
Why does it even happen in the first place?
Yeah.
Yes.
Things to explore.
That's a really solid introduction, I think, to the sorts of things Allison Stoner cares about. And they have been very active, including about legislation to protect child actors and child influencers. And Christy, I think, well, I sort of know, very much wanted to align herself with Allison Stoner. They were aligned for a while, so much so that at some point, Allison Stoner had been set up to release their Dear Hollywood project through PodCo, something I know about because of the YouTuber Cheyenne, who made coverage about Christy, Carlson, Romano versus Alexa Nicholas, back when Alexa's grift was less obvious. I'm going to link Cheyenne's video in the description below, even though I think that video was made with a very different set of easily available information about Alexa Nicholas than exists now that Alexa threw her lot in so fully with Drake in the aftermath of Quiet on Set. Those videos are from before that, so just be aware of that. Rather than continuing to show you clips from the Vulnerable podcast episodes that Allison was on, I want to show you what Allison says on that first episode of Dear Hollywood on their own YouTube channel. Again, not distributed through PodCo.
Okay, I have to tell you this because it illustrates the purpose of this podcast in real time. So, I actually wrote and recorded Dear Hollywood over a year ago, and I interviewed really special guests for it, but I can't release it. I was collaborating with a production company who was truly wonderful at first, but then they switched their legal team, and the new person decided on the recording of the final episode that in order to move forward, I needed to sign a contract stating I would not get paid a cent for my work upfront, though their team would. Further, on the back end, their company would get to make around $100,000 from ad revenue before I would see a single cent. This was the budget breakdown from the podcast. The associate producer would be making 16 grand and the production fee would be 16 grand. Cast. That's me. That's the budget. Then they said that they would give me $1,000 per episode, even though the associate producer would be making more than that. The associate producer.
And that's what I meant earlier that you might have already had in mind. The thing you might already know about that was making bullshit sirens go off for you maybe when Christy said that this whole podcast thing is meant to be empowering to the former child actors. The big empowering podcast deal for Allison was that. That's why I felt so confident saying earlier that it wasn't just the main three on the Ned's podcast splitting the revenue. There is absolutely no way that Allison Stoner, with their resume, their reputations, and their connections, was offered a remarkably bad deal. I think they just were one of the only people who was remarkable enough to walk directly away from it. And that whole story makes me feel just incredible frustration at Christy, Carlson, Romano. I don't know for sure that she's the associate producer. She very well may not have been, but I do kind of doubt that she wasn't included somewhere in that pay structure. And yeah, all businesses are kind of shaped like a pyramid, and Christy wasn't selling essential oils or whatever, but is this a lot better than a pyramid scheme, do we think? Actually, hold that thought. I'm going to make that its own section. We will circle back to whether or not PodCo was a pyramid scheme. But yes, Allison Stoner distributed Dear Hollywood independently, and here is the rest of what they said about that.
Given this was the podcast based on my literal life story of being taken advantage of as an artist, and that I spent a year writing every episode myself, tapping my personal network for guests, recording it on my own computer and equipment at home that I purchased and trained myself to use, and really, I was only relying on them to help distribute it to a larger audience, I chose to walk away from the deal. Unfortunately, I'm not permitted to share the footage or those interviews, but I do have my dignity and all of the intellectual property in my mind, heart, and hard drive.
And then Cheyenne pointed this out in their video from one of those later appearances that Allison Stoner did on Vulnerable.
I was listening to Allison's pod, okay? It's called Dear Hollywood. It's all over the charts. I've been supporting it. At least as much as I could. We wanted to use this space. It didn't end up being an option.
I was right. And I feel like I kind of broke that. Not gonna lie, not like my video got a ton of views or whatever, but I knew that and I said that in my video before anybody was talking about that. So that's kind of a dub for me. I'm gonna take that. But there's a weird cut. Look at this.
And when Allison created it, I was like, well, this worked out perfect. When I started listening to the first...
Did you see that? There's a weird cut when they're talking about why Allison's podcast didn't work with PodCo. I really want to know what they cut out. It's really annoying me.
I was like, well, this worked out perfect. When I started listening to the first...
That's such a hard cut. I had to play it again because it's so telling. But again, Allison is here and talking with Christy, and there seems to be no bad blood at all. So it's like, not anything that we should look too into, I guess. But I wonder if Allison made like a snide comment that alluded to some of the things that we saw Allison talk about in my original video about the pay and everything. And then they decided to cut that out because they didn't want to, because Christy's just like, oh yeah, it didn't end up working out. Why, Christy? In your own words, why didn't it work out? I'm just curious. Is that part of your advocacy as well?
Totally agree with Cheyenne on that point. I want to know so bad what's behind that cut. Again, the same way that I feel like Allison Stoner is a lot of what Alexa Nicholas wants to present herself as, Allison Stoner is absolutely just so much of what Christy Carlson Romano wants to present herself as and to be associated with. I really respect Allison. I know I already said that, but I'm just saying it again because I know I don't have a lot of respect for Christy Carlson Romano. This treatment of Allison Stoner is a lot of why I know I don't have a lot of that respect. While I'm still struggling to find like a definitive list of all of the PodCo shows that did exist, I found a Variety write-up from 2023 that gave us a good idea of what existed at that point. So 2023 is when it says that Christy officially launched PodCo, a podcast network that will focus on rewatches hosted by the stars of popular TV series. So it explains the Wizards of Waverly Place podcast, it explains the Ned's Declassified School Survival podcast, which we've already spoken about at length at this point, the Brotherly Love podcast, which was launched that same February as the Ned's Declassified one, and Even More Stevens, which was hosted by Christy Carlson Romano along with Nick Spano, who played Donnie Stevens, and Stephen Anthony Lawrence, who played Bernard's Beans in Even Stevens. That launched the same March too, except you might have noticed that neither of those last two have come up at all so far. That's because they weren't recently canceled. In the case of the Brotherly Love podcast, they just left the PodCo network. And that's a similarity, actually, between the Brotherly Love podcast and Even More Stevens, where they were told that they had to go on pause during the SAG-AFTRA strike. Even More Stevens just never seems to have come back. Christy posted a video explaining that they were on pause and that they regretted that they had to take a pause, but they didn't do any more episodes after that. This article from Variety also says that there was a Broadway-themed podcast with details yet to come. I never heard anything about that one. And it says, the company, with a studio in downtown Los Angeles and plans to expand to Burbank, is led by Romano as partner and her husband, Brendan Rooney, the Vulnerable podcast and the I Hear Voices podcast as founder and CEO. So yeah, I guess I've really been leaving Brendan Rooney out of this because I had no idea who that guy was. I assumed PodCo was like entirely Christy. There is, however, well, there's a lot of episodes of Vulnerable with the husband on it because I think he was co-hosting it with her at one point. He definitely was during that episode that Allison Stoner was in right at first. I guess I have to watch the episode of Vulnerable where she interviewed her husband. Yeah, no, sorry. I'm not doing that. I tried. I really want very few things less than I want to sit around and listen to these two and their opinion on parenting. I feel like I do kind of have the gist. I mean, I feel like the way that Allison Stoner was treated kind of is the gist. I feel like Christy Carlson Romano constantly trying to figure out which nostalgia rewatch slop is going to work. It's all the gist. Brendan Rooney is just like the business boy who was trying to make this happen for a while. I'm pretty sure, I don't know. I don't really feel like listening about his time in boot camp, so I'm gonna trunk that, actually. I know I said I would listen. I'm not. If you listened and there's anything interesting, let me know, but I kind of doubt it. So let me talk instead about what's currently going on with Christy Carlson Romano and Brendan Rooney, which is that neither of them still have the PodCo handle in their Instagram bios, where it previously already had been. And a lot of the episodes, though they, at some point after people started noticing that they had gone quiet, or maybe they would have either way, a lot of them began to do the re-uploads that I mentioned earlier, like on Christy Carlson Romano's channel. The Wizards of Waverly Place podcast, which had the actress Jennifer Stone, who played Harper, and the guy who played Jerry, David DeLuise, that Instagram account posted, Wizard fans, the Wizards of Waverly Pod is pausing time for a bit, but don't worry, it's not goodbye, it's just a quick trip to the Wizard Lair to recharge our magic. We want to say a huge thank you to all of you, our amazing fans, for making this journey so magical. Your love, laughs, and support mean the world to us. Stay tuned, keep the magic alive, and remember, everything is not what it seems. When somebody thanked them in the comments for the update, they were like, yeah, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Which, much like Devin mentioning that it wasn't just Ned's being canceled, clearly there was some kind of restructuring happening. But again, a lot of speculation. At least as recently as this summer, Christy Carlson Romano and her husband were asking on LinkedIn, looking for like a finance partner, it looks like. Huge shout out to the Nuance Corner friend who messaged me with these screenshots because I, for some reason, never thought to check LinkedIn for Christy Carlson Romano. And of course Christy Carlson Romano is on LinkedIn. Where else would she be? Another PodCo podcast that existed, but that got canceled right around the same time as Wizards and Neds is the Pretty Little Liars True Crime podcast. Like I said before, that one also has Lindsay Shaw, and it also has an actress named Tammin Sursok. And Tammin played Jenna in Pretty Little Liars. Lindsay also was not a main character in Pretty Little Liars. I think, when I was saying earlier that the Neds cast is like the straightest shot at one of these, I think it's as tangential as it gets with the Pretty Little Liars podcast. Tammin posted, "Dearest Pretty Little Liars fans, after some discussion the PodCo has decided to go in a different direction and put down the podcast of Pretty Little Liars True Crime. There is a world where we could continue the show on our own in the future, but as of now, there will be no more new episodes of the show. We are grateful for PodCo giving us the opportunity and for all of you as our fans. We love you guys and are heartbroken too. Hopefully we can pick this up in the future. Stay tuned. Heart." And then she had tagged Lindsay and also the guy who did a true crime segment at the end of every episode of the Pretty Little Liars True Crime podcast, because that was their whole bit, I guess. I watched like 2 episodes of this, and in the second episode, they fully forgot to even talk about the episode that their rewatch podcast was about. And I kind of told myself, maybe I'll watch more, and then I was like, I'm never going to finish 20 episodes of the Pretty Little Liars True Crime podcast as quickly as I would like to finish this PodCo deep dive. Tammin played Jenna, who was like in the pilot of Pretty Little Liars and a lot of the early episodes, but again, just these were not main characters. This podcast, I don't think, was drawing a whole bunch of attention, but when we look at the numbers in a bit, we'll see for sure. And there's not nearly as much controversy associated with this Pretty Little Liars one, at least not that I'm aware of, but there was controversy before it began. I did see a TikTok before the podcast with Lindsay and Tammin began, where the host of a small fan podcast called Pretty Little Podcast was essentially like begging for the name of the podcast she and her sister host not to be stolen by these celebrities and therefore bury them in the Google search results. I got mixed feelings about this one. I'm pretty much standing with those small creators just out of the principle of the thing. My real take is I think both of those podcasts could have come up with a better name than Pretty Little Podcast. Like, of course, that's the first thing you think of if you're going to come up with like a really easy and low effort name for a Pretty Little Liars podcast. But I'm more endeared by fans doing that than I am by like celebrities. The hosts of the original podcast had been told at first that it was like too late on the PodCo end for them to change the name of their podcast, but then the TikTok got a lot of views and eventually Tammin reached out and they changed the name of their podcast to Pretty Little Liars True Crime. The true crime element in this podcast was really weird. Like I said, they had a specific designated guy and he was like a real life death investigator and they were like asking him their questions about Pretty Little Liars, which is maybe a slightly less ghoulish than usual way to do a true crime podcast compared to talking about real deaths, but I don't know. It was a weird vibe. I believe the Brotherly Love podcast is still going, but they're independent. Like I said earlier, they left during the SAG-AFTRA strike, during which a lot of PodCo shows like paused production because they weren't supposed to be talking about Hollywood and stuff like that. The Lawrence brothers, essentially, from what I saw on Reddit, were like, oh, we don't talk about Hollywood anyway, so we're just not going to be a PodCo podcast because we don't want to have to respect the strike. I think that strike was kind of like the first falling of some dominoes for PodCo, perhaps, having to go on pause when they thought that they had like a really easy setup that they could just milk forever. Some of the shows didn't come back from that. Some of the shows continued for a while, probably the ones that had higher viewership than the ones that just never came back from the strike. And then there's also the Big Names podcast that Christy Carlson Romano hosts with Annalise Vanderpool. It was known for a while as Big Name Bitches, and then it changed its name. I think there might have been one other name, but I'm not sure. That podcast seems to have also gone through a few different iterations, and we'll get back to that one. I'm going to save it for last in this portion, since I don't believe that one is canceled, but I don't know whether or not it's not canceled. I have spent a frankly embarrassing amount of time working on this chart, and even still, I know it's not perfect, but it will take an even more embarrassing amount of time to make it perfect. I do think that it's accurate at least giving, like, a glimpse. During my arts and crafts time on Canva this morning, I went ahead and I charted where each of these Nostalgia Bait podcasts that Christy launched started in terms of viewership and some of their spikes through the end. It's not perfect because not all of them had the same amount of episodes. I did adjust part of it, but like I didn't go to all of the trouble of putting like late stage Neds against late stage of a podcast that canceled early. Those are compared to middle stage Neds because of how much longer the Ned's Declassified podcast went on than the other ones. You'll see what I mean. And I think I can overlay it. The Wizards podcast launched very, very small compared to the Ned's Declassified podcast. But it did, it did okay. It especially did well when it had a guest star like Selena Gomez. And they pulled a few other guest stars, especially considering, I keep referencing that whole Allison Stoner thing, especially considering Allison saying it was her own contracts. Like, I feel like maybe Jerry has just been in the industry long enough that he has friends. I don't know. Like, I think we can fully class that 1.9 million launch for the Neds pod as an outlier. That was not something that Christy Carlson Romano was able to recreate. It's not something she had been able to create before that. But that launch was huge for the Neds podcast. And it makes me wonder if the Neds podcast launching so big is part of why other shows got greenlit. And then it was just like, we're going to dump all of this money like we dumped into Neds before we realized that Neds wasn't actually giving us money back. The Big Name Bitches podcast, that one has gone through a lot of different iterations and it has never done particularly well. Like, you might not even have immediately noticed it on the chart. That's an 87,000 view launch compared to the other ones at least getting a couple 100,000. Big Name Bitches was originally, I think the idea was that it was like their guests were the big name bitches who would come on and talk. And then eventually, I think Chelsea from That's So Raven and Christy Carlson Romano were the big name bitches, and they were doing like a talkie podcast. And then now they're like going out and doing experiences. And when I said that I think that it might have been like not quite so canceled, but also canceled, I mean, I think they probably like had a budget to film like 10 episodes all at once, and they did that, and they're waiting to see if any of those do well, and I don't think they will. The Full House pod is pretty much our only remaining interesting case study here. I assumed that the Full House pod was doing better than it was because the Full House pod is the only one other than those clearly like already recorded and produced episodes of Big Names that have been continuing to come out since the Ned's announcement. But there's definitely something going on there. It launched smaller than the other ones did, which was a surprise to me. Also, should note that I have no idea what the numbers are on like actual streaming services for any of these. This is just on YouTube views. Maybe this one is doing really well on like streaming services and that's why it's continuing, or maybe it is just like a genuine passion project. An interesting change, though, from earlier episodes of the Full House podcast that I looked back on and the new one that I watched that had been uploaded after the Ned's announcement is that the PodCo branding is no longer present. Dave Coulier no longer had to stop and say, please subscribe. And that might have been because it was like a different tone and he was sharing his recent cancer diagnosis, but it also might have been because PodCo either is no longer producing or because they took a huge step back on what producing means. I would say that I thought that they weren't producing it at all and that it was now an independent podcast, but there are two things that make me think not. One being that it is still listed under Apple Podcasts for PodCo, even though the new episodes are coming out. Two being another screenshot that I was sent from LinkedIn, but that isn't by a former child actor, so I don't really want to put it on. Somebody who works for PodCo posted that they are helping to produce the Full House Rewind podcast. And they shared the episode where Dave Coulier had like talked about his cancer diagnosis and also introduced his new permanent guest star. But I have just no idea if that's happening where this guy works for PodCo and is also helping produce an independent podcast and posted about it on LinkedIn, or that he's producing it in a PodCo capacity, but not a big enough PodCo capacity that they still have to have the PodCo boxes on the microphones. I don't know. A lower budget does make sense to me because, like I said, it's a new permanent co-host rather than having a rotating cast of guest stars. But that also might not be because of a lower budget. It might just be because Dave Coulier is ill and does not want to have to deal with tapping his own network for guest stars like Allison Stoner talked about doing for their own series. I've never watched the Full House Rewind podcast. I ditched out of the episode that I did start watching once they, introduced the new co-host and moved into actually talking about an episode because I was like, I'm fine. For me, the Full House Rewind is remembering laying in bed at my grandma's house. It's not like watching a podcast with people who are on there. But I did find that interesting because my assumption, and this is not an assumption that's backed up by anything, but my assumption is that these shows with a slightly older fan base probably have a more consistent audience for this kind of nostalgia. I think people are more nostalgic for Full House and for Boy Meets World than they are for Ned's Declassified. And I think, as evidenced by the fact that the Wizards podcast also didn't do very well, even a show that was more popular than Ned's Declassified, I don't know how well that would do. If they were going to do a Hannah Montana rewatch podcast, the parts where they were talking about the Hannah Montana show would be everybody's least favorite part of that rewatch podcast. But if Miley Cyrus felt like launching a podcast, that could happen and it could do well if Miley had the right idea for it, I think. Not that there wouldn't be less problematic baggage for Miley Cyrus, but I feel like she's already battling that. And also she's too busy for a podcast right now, so why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it because Christy, Carlson, Romano infected me with a brainworm that made me start thinking about former child actors having podcasts and whether or not any of them actually could do that successfully. The Full House pod did really drop for a while, but I don't know. I think if it's being produced independently, and especially if it's any level of a passion project for the people working on it, it could do well. As I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, this is still, for the most part, much higher than any numbers I am consistently pulling. Some of those low episodes of Wizards Pod, I'm like, okay, maybe more people watched my videos than the Wizards of Waverly Place podcast. That's weird. Again, though, people could be watching that on Spotify and Apple Music and stuff, and my stuff is not there. I really get this feeling that, for Christy, Carlson, Romano, and for PodCo, this all kind of just seemed like a money printing hack. Oh, we don't have to pay royalties to Disney, even if we summarize the sitcom or whatever, because we're not showing it. And what that means in practice is that the actual rewatch portion of their podcast is if they remember to get to it, a couple of minutes of somebody deadpan reading the events from a notebook or something, in the case of the Pretty Little Liars podcast episodes I watched. And for me, I'm thinking, you know what? If I wanted this, if I wanted a recap of everything that happens in Pretty Little Liars, I've already watched Mike's Mike do that. And that doesn't mean that nobody else can try. It doesn't mean that these celebrities can't try, but which isn't to say that they can't do it, but it is to say either put some effort into it or change the concept of what you're doing away from being a rewatch podcast. But what do you get when you do that? You get vulnerable, and vulnerable is not good. I didn't realize until part of that episode that I watched earlier where she was interviewing her husband, but in addition to running around and saying that this is an empowering thing for former child actors, Christy, Carlson, Romano refers to vulnerable as a mental health space. I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure her degree is in business, though, and I can't feel as, uncomfortable and pushbacky about Alexa Nicholas referring to Eat Predators as, a survivor-led collective and safe space and all that when she has no qualifications, for me not to be annoyed by Christy, Carlson, Romano doing the same thing. Girl, no. Vulnerable is not a mental health space. It is a podcast. It is maybe a more serious and somber version of a drama podcast, but it's a celebrity conversation podcast. To call it a mental health space is just self-important in a way that I cannot believe a woman whose most popular YouTube video is her making the Nako from Kim Possible can actually try to sell herself as. And that's why I'm less annoyed by whatever she's doing now with the Big Names podcast. Like, yeah, go do, like, training to be a cheerleader or whatever. Make things that people who want to watch you will want to watch, and then enjoy that and enjoy that connection. But, like, don't condescend me. Don't tell me that this is something that it is not. Because these PodCo rewatch podcasts, those are not empowering. And if anybody was offered a deal that was even remotely similar to what Allison Stoner describes, I would assume it's not empowering to anybody but to Christy, Carlson, Romano. So while I think what really happened wasn't actually some big reckoning, wasn't actually particular consequences for any one cast or set of events, I think Christy, Carlson, Romano, unfortunately, I think the only lesson she really learned here was that there was only so big she could blow that bubble before it popped. I don't think there was any real reckoning with her content or what she's doing. I don't think that there will be a noticeable step back in her trying to refer to herself as an activist and an advocate and talk about, like, how important what she's doing is. I think she does feel like what she's doing is important, but I just am not on board with it. We know the Full House podcast is continuing, whether that is with or without PodCo. We know there are new episodes of Big Names uploading. We know the Ned's podcast said they still want to do a reboot, which seems to have always been the case for them, so that's not really an update, but they did say that they want to try to continue the podcast in the future. What I would imagine the Ned's podcast will look like when it is rebooted, and again, I've said this so many times, but just speculation, I am just guessing at you. I would assume that they might go to, like, a Zoom thing, and I think if they go to a Zoom thing, there's already going to be a very small amount of people who are still following them over, and if it's not an in-person thing, and Lindsay and Devin aren't doing, like, oh god, I didn't even get into this, but I don't have a better word for it other than straight people queerbait. They're, like, always, again, because they're talking about their old relationship, but they're, like, flirting with each other too, and I don't believe it's real. I think that it's put on for the camera, but whatever. I think if all of that is happening, like, not in the same room, it's going to lose a lot of the charm of what was happening in the PodCo podcast, because they were at least in the same room. But I also obviously didn't think it had a lot of charm to lose in the first place. So I'm not here to, like, give them actionable advice. I hope and pray that none of these people ever see my video. And I do think Christy could see some success in, like, finding a way to lean into just having a YouTube channel and doing content on YouTube and getting sponsorships and brand deals and stuff that way. But she's also been trying to do that for a while. And maybe that's another reason why the views for this aren't awesome on YouTube. Like, me personally, if I'm going on YouTube, I'm gonna watch, like, a video essay and not nostalgia bait from a former child actor. But I clearly use YouTube differently than a lot of people do. I would love to know what you make of all of this, if you thought that this was a fun deep dive. I know that there is more internet drama with Christy, Carlson, Romano. I'm aware that she, like, gets into beefs in, like, when people post about her, she comments on it sometimes. I know that she had, like, some back and forth with the Do We Know Them girlies, and again, like I said with the Pretty Little Liars podcast, I felt like that was going to take me a little bit too long to research. If people are interested in a recap of Christy, Carlson, Romano versus Do We Know Them, I could do that. Let me know. I probably won't be until January, though, because I have a lot of ideas for December. I also wanted to make sure that I get this out before the inevitable Business Insider write-up about the dissolution of PodCo or whatever, because I can feel it. Everyone else is also curious about what's going on with PodCo. Surely somebody with more answers than me or more access to ways to find them has been looking into this and will break it all very soon. But this is what I figured out so far. This is what I got when I looked into it for you. My take remains what it always is. Christy Carlson Romano is a capitalist. Christy Carlson Romano uses the language and the appearance of activism to further her own cause. And Christy Carlson Romano is Alexa Nicholas. Drake Bell is Corey Feldman. All of this is a circle. Everyone does the same behaviors they hate each other for. I said earlier, I Hear Voices with PodCo. I have seen that listed as PodCo multiple places online, and then when I looked it up on Spotify, it was iHeartRadio. So I don't know if the idea was that it was going to be picked up by PodCo and then again the strike and then it never happened. I don't know if it was just erroneously listed as PodCo in the write-up that I saw it mentioned in, but I don't know. I think it was just an oversaturated market by the time Christy got there, and then it got more and more oversaturated because that launch, that huge Ned's Declassified launch, made them think they really had something when they didn't. And that does sound frustrating. I'm not like a fan of Josh Peck, but this makes me think a lot of Josh Peck's memoir, Happy People Are Annoying, which I read before I'm Glad My Mom Died came out, and I'm glad I did, because I'm not sure I could get through that in a post I'm Glad My Mom Died world, because I would be like, why do I care? But what was really interesting to me about Josh Peck is that there was this kind of repeated sentiment and feeling of like, something I agree with, which is he did a lot of work when he was on Drake and Josh, and he should be getting residuals for that because it is still airing in syndication. I agree with him about that. But there is this other sentiment of like, and therefore I should be very wealthy, and it is a disservice that the world is doing to me that I am not very wealthy yet, was my like overwhelming takeaway from Josh Peck, which is why it was very easy for me to just like not like him anymore once I saw his whole, Jeanette owes us one, when Jeanette wanted to pull the episode from his podcast that she was on. But I also don't know how you wouldn't get there if, like, so much of your childhood was about earning money and then that money doesn't, like, hold. That's gotta be hard to come back from developmentally. And that is something that I also, like, you know, I do have empathy for former child actors. I don't like Christy Carlson Romano as a person. I don't like her business model or how she seems to have used it. I think it's a little bit exploitative. But was all of this a pyramid scheme? And I'm inclined to say if everybody got the deal Allison Stoner got, just yeah. But I think I have to hope Christy at least wanted some of these to do well. I just don't think that it was actually for an empowering purpose. I think, again, it was for a wallet thickening purpose. And that's just how content works. If she's upfront with that in whatever she's doing next, I will not have anything to say about it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Let me know if there are any other situations that you would like me to check in on. Let me know if you're seeing this in like a couple of weeks, because Christy Carlson Romano uploaded an episode of the Vulnerable podcast that was like getting vulnerable about PodCo being a failure. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with this whole thing. I just know PodCo has collapsed. End of the day, end of the 4 days that I spent working on this, I think we are living in the post-apocalypse. I think it's over. I'd love to know what you think. Let me know. Thank you so much to my lovely Patreon subscribers, a few of whose names you can see on the screen right now. Patreon is a great way to help support me if you're interested in a couple of extra videos from me every month, as well as my coffee. That's like for one-off. If you just want to toss me a couple bucks, that's a huge help. I really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate everybody who has supported me through the Patreon, through the coffee, even just by watching my videos, liking them, staying here all the way to the end. I'll be back soon. We're going to talk about some things I love before the end of the year. That was also a suggestion in my new suggestion form, which I really appreciated, and was already my plan. I am extremely into the musical Rent, and we're going to talk about that on Christmas Eve. So make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss that, or other future conversations like this one. I hope you have a great rest of your day, night, whatever time it is, and I hope Christy Carlson Romano doesn't start another podcast. Bye.